So welcome everyone. I'm Len, editor of Foresight. Um, Almost all of you are members of the International Institute of Forecasters, so you know all about our journals. Foresight being the practitioner journal for the institute. We've been running these annual Foresight practitioner conferences for several years. This could be our 6th or 7th iteration, but this is the first time we're virtual. And if the world permits, maybe it will be the last time we need to be virtual. We've had a good time at all the in-person conferences, good locations, spirited group of audiences, and a few nice parties. Stefan can attest to that. There is one announcement I would like to make about Foresight, and that we've established Foresight Hall of Fame Awards, which will recognize the best papers that we've published since we began publication 15 years ago. We'll announce the winners at the virtual International Symposium on Forecasting sometime next year. And then the winners will be awarded with a $500 grant. We think we'll start with about 10 papers. Our criteria for the award include influence on forecasting thought, research, and practice, and our process for nominating candidates will be announced in early 2021. A couple of business items. All participants other than the speaker, well, I think you know this already, you should be muted. During each talk, you can use the chat box to ask a question, but at the end of each talk, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A or whatever time it takes. We'll have a live Q&A where you can interact directly with the speaker. Let me give you a quick rundown of the people who will be talking at the conference. Rich Herron is leader of corporate integrated business planning at Eastman Chemical Company. He's a former consultant, vice president of operations and planning, and a corporate supply chain director. Rich, can you wave at the group or say hello? Where are you? Okay. My co-host for this conference is Dean Sorensen, who's the principal of IBP Collaborative. He's an advisory board member of the Operational Excellence Society. Dean is truly a thought leader on IBP, Integrated Business Planning, with a broad mix of strategic, financial, and operational experience across many, many companies. I'll be turning it over to Dean in just a few minutes. Chris Turner is founder of StrataBridge, which advises clients, AZ, Coca-Cola, Shell, many others, on strategy development, deployment, and delivery. He was involved in the development of the 5-step S&OP process, as well as the Class A checklist for business excellence. Stefan, who has been at several of our conferences as a speaker, is the founder and CEO of Wahupa, develops probabilistic forecasting and planning systems. Stefan has decades of experience in supply chain forecasting, planning, and scheduling, and has written persuasively about the integration of artificial and human intelligence. Jerry has decades of experience in logistics consulting and supply chain modeling. His forte is applying quantitative techniques to supply chain problems, and he's participated as a speaker and lecturer in major conferences and seminars around the world. Finally, Eric is founder and principal of NextView, which works with mid-market as well as global corporations on supply chain improvement. He's a consultant, he's an author, he's a trainer with considerable global experience. At this point, I'm going to stop the screen share and turn the conference over to my co-host, Dean Sorensen.
So can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me get the slideshow view. So thank you everybody for attending today. I'm really happy to be a part of this conference. Really thrilled with to be working with Len on this. I find that Len and the Foresight Group are really kind of forward thinkers and really want to push the envelope on integrated business planning. I'm really happy to be associated with the group. Just a few kind of upfront comments about what we're going to be talking about today. Really all about integrated business planning effectiveness. And you know, I've mentioned here on the screen that that a lot of the focus will be on manufacturing, but a lot of the comments apply to other industries as well. But you know, the question that we'll be addressing is, why is integrated business planning less effective in global manufacturers than smaller and less complex ones? You know, I think that, you know, in smaller companies, I think S&OP and IBP, you've got a lot of really good demonstrated benefits and value from using these processes. But as you get bigger, I find that those sorts of benefits are not as prolific as one would like. And you know, as we're talking about integrated business planning, you know, the same relationship that as you get larger and more complex, it's not only integrated business planning, but there's a lot of terms being used out there like integrated financial planning, integrated performance management, same sort of relationship that we're really not seeing the same kind of benefits as we are in smaller companies. And as well, one of the questions that we also want to be addressing here is, why is it that organizations are not getting more value from planning and forecasting innovation? So, you know, this group has been really focused on forecasting, and you know, my understanding is that there's been a lot of discussions about how to improve it, but it's not necessarily translating into bottom line results or expected bottom line results. So one of the questions that we'll be answering is, why is that? A lot of this conference I think the genesis of it was based on an article that I wrote about integrated business planning, and I think that for all of you that are members, you have access to it. This was published, I think, in the winter edition. And, you know, I think that one of the things we're finding, and one of the things I wrote about, is I think, you know, the traditional 4-step or 5-step process, however you want to talk about it, I think is really not working as well as we would like. It's really kind of missing the mark. And one of the reasons for that, I think that, you know, if you look at, you know, a lot of the innovations that have taken place in terms of analytics over the past 5 or 10 years, I think there's just been some phenomenal things that have come out and very impressive stuff. But I think one of the things I believe that a lot of these innovations are built on a weak foundation. And that's kind of the focal point of what we're going to be talking about. Because if you look at integrated business planning, you know, the value of integrated business planning is predicated on the free flow of resources across functions and entities. And I think that's just not happening. And that's the foundation, one of the key foundational pieces that we're going to be talking about today. Now, I just took a few different definitions of integrated business planning off a few different websites, and doesn't really matter who they are, but the key takeaway here is that there are umpteen number of definitions of integrated business planning. You ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 entirely different answers. And some of them are based on, advanced S&OP. Some of them refer to IBP as an approach. To me, what IBP is, in fact, is a process. And I just think of it simply like we've looked at, people would refer to things like supply and demand balancing as one of the key objectives of IBP or S&OP. But to me, ultimately, the objective and what it does is it's a process for planning, managing, and governing outcomes from strategic, financial, and operational and commercial perspectives. That's what it is. And it's that whole idea of how you balance, align, and optimize these different perspectives is really where we're having difficulty. So as we talk through, as we go through the different sessions today, mine being the first, I just want to give you an idea of some of the things that we're going to be talking about and some of the questions that we're going to be addressing. So you can see on mine, one of the key things that we're going to be talking about is what is strategic IBP. So I talked about it in my article. I want to give you an idea of what comprises it and what's different about it and what incremental capabilities would a strategic IBP process have that we just haven't really been talking about before. And what's new that enables this. So it's nice that you got this process, but if I can't implement it, then it really doesn't help me too much. And what are these processes worth and how can this value be realized? So those are kind of the key questions that I'm going to be addressing. So Chris is really going to be talking about this from a strategic perspective. Some of the key questions that he'll be talking about is how do you drive strategy with IBP? And how should IBP enable organizations to cope with uncertainty and change? I think especially in this day and age with what's happened in the past X number of months, and how should IBP enable companies to cope with these sorts of things? So a lot of this is going to be talking about how do you drive the design of IBP from the top down, and what role must the CEO and the entire executive team play in design. Stefan is going to be, we'll turn him over, he's going to be talking about forecasting and embedding the forecast into an integrated process. And what are the sort of innovations that are kind of driving value there, especially when it comes to probabilistic forecasting and planning, and what key requirements are required to enable that kind of a process. Jerry is going to be talking about planning in general, and one of the questions he's going to be talking about is why do organizations struggle with planning and scenario planning, and why do projects fail, and what sorts of things can you do to avoid failures in these sorts of projects. And Eric is going to be talking about a research study that we're going to be undertaking through Foresight. He's going to be talking about what are the objectives of the research study. We're going to be trying to understand what are organizations really experiencing and how you can benefit from participating. But broadly, one of the things that we're going to be testing are some of the hypotheses and the observations that you'll be hearing in this session. And then one of the things that we'll also be doing after each session is getting Richard's perspective. Now, Richard's been a practitioner for many years. To me, I've spoken to a lot of different people in organizations who are, like I say, practitioners. But in my mind, he's probably one of the most forward-thinking guys I've ever run across in industry. To me, this guy really understands where IBP ought to be going. He's been through it many times. He's seen the pitfalls, And one of the things that I know that he understands is what things must organizations be doing to avoid these kind of pitfalls. So let me just turn it over quickly to Richard to kind of get his thoughts on some of the things that he's seen and some of his perspectives before we get too deep into it.
Hey, Dean, thanks for the pat on the back. But I tell you, I'm looking at some of the names that I see on here, and I kind of feel like a midget among giants, to be honest with you, in the IBP. Some of these people I'm seeing a lot of respect, including Dean. I've been kind of on and off talking to Dean for 15 years now through all the different companies I've worked with. I've come across Stefan many times in my past, Eric Tinker, always read his stuff on LinkedIn. Mike Gilliland, I was just showing his book. I was reading his book this morning. So very impressive people on here. What I'm excited about in this whole thing is I have been in this field for the last 30 years. I started early in my career with what was Ciba-Geigy. At Ciba-Geigy, I worked with Chris Turner's team at Stratabridge on trying to implement what was S&OP at the time. S&OP, advanced S&OP, now IBP is the key word. And yeah, what I'm hoping to get from here, the challenge in the past is really all been around, well, everywhere I've gone to walk into an IBP type of project, everybody has a different view, a different opinion. Well, when you ask them, what does IBP mean to you? Well, this is IBP. It's all the way from just simple balancing of supply and demand, all the way to, well, we're just doing simple order management, all the way up to advanced kind of thinking that I'm hearing from the guys who are speaking today, all the way down to, well, no, it is a management process that actually puts you in control of your free cash flow over the next 24 to 36 months. Challenges in my past have always been around the process, just really identify the scope of the process. Always struggle with a lack of involvement of finance, right? With a lack of what is the real objective of an IBP process? Is the objective just to get a balanced supply demand process, or is the objective really to ensure we're profitably meeting or we're generating cash in a profitable manner kind of stuff? Dean's, I think, is going to talk a lot about the need for executive education, the need for a real set of what are the real outcomes. Struggle has always been around tools, right? We've tried to build these things on top of these huge ERP systems that are pretty inflexible. Everywhere I've been over the last 30 years, it's what I call a spread mart. Everybody's using Excel spreadsheets. It's all disconnected. There's no integration to integrated business planning. Most places, it takes us a month and a half to go through an IBP cycle because of all the different systems, all the different handoffs, things like that. So I'm really excited about hearing more from all the speakers about this question I get. People don't understand how it's possible to do what we're talking about doing with IBP, because they've all got their blinders on, and this is the system. These are the big ERP systems. This is the Excel. These are the tools I've had, and these are the processes I've had. So it's hard for people to understand, well, how do I tie all that together and get really integrated? I'm really looking forward to hearing more on this, because I think this is the first time in my career that I've seen an approach from a group that's saying, well, we're going to take process, we're going to incorporate finance, and we're going to put it all within one suite of interconnected tools. Does that help, Dean? Is that?
Yep, great. Great. So thanks for that. So with that, let me just get into my presentation. So the presentation that I'm giving is consistent with the article that I wrote. So the intention will be to explain some of the perspectives I had in the article, and I'm assuming that most people will have access to the article through the Foresight website. And if you don't, I'm sure you can get access to it. So as I said before, these are, the questions that we're going to be addressing today. I won't repeat them because I covered them earlier, but probably one of the big things I just want to reiterate, I really want to talk about what are these processes really worth, and how can you realize this value. So let me just talk about the things that I'm going to be the topics I'm going to be covering today. So first off, what I'd like to do is talk about a case study with a global manufacturer that's currently undergoing an IBP project, and kind of give you an idea of some of the key learning points from that. Then what I'd like to do is just step back and take a pulse of the current state of IBP, and I'd like to get into a little bit more into more detail about the maturity model I wrote about in the article. Then I'm going to talk about another case study about a book manufacturer that I work with, and then use that as a springboard to talk about, well, when we talk about strategic IBP, what are these incremental capabilities that companies are really struggling with? Then talk about what sort of technology enablers are out there to kind of address some of these gaps, and then talk about strategic IBP from a finance perspective. And then I'll wrap up with a few summary comments, and I'll get Richard's take on some of the things that that I talked about, and then open it up for questions and comments. So one of the things I should tell you, that there's going to be a few points in the presentation. I'm just going to be kind of skimming the surface on some of the topics. And at some points, I'll make you aware of other places where you can kind of get more detail. So on our website, there's some articles and blogs, and there's actually a video section there. And there's probably like 5 or 6 hours worth of video, and everything I'm covering today is in those videos somewhere. So in some cases, like I say, where I'm just really trying to make a point, and if you want more detail, I'll let you know where you can get more information. So with that, what I'd like to do is just talk about this global manufacturer that I was working with. And probably one of the biggest things about this manufacturer is a very complex manufacturer. Like a lot of companies that are pursuing operational excellence, they have a defined digital transformation strategy they're pursuing. They're trying to shift from commodity to specialty products, and they're seeing IBP as a key driver of this strategy. And some of the objectives that they had set out for IBP was to drive profitable growth, to support the specialty product strategy, but also enable segment leaders to drive these profit and cash flow targets. So that was a big one. And then from some of the contributing objectives, one of the things I want to be able to do is to quickly align or realign cost structures as conditions change, maximize the results from operational excellence. And I thought the last one is actually really insightful on their part, which I thought that not all companies do, is that they wanted the CEO in particular really wanted to drive accurate cash flow forecasting, and actually more specifically free cash flow forecasting. And I think that one of the things that I believe is that cash flow forecasting is probably one of the best leading indicators of how effective an IBP process is, because if you can't forecast cash, you probably don't understand resource consumption. And ultimately, what we're really trying to do is align targets with resources. So that's why I look at cash flow forecasting that way. So, one of the things that I was asked to do is to give my perspectives on the approach that they were taking, and whether it would achieve the objective. So they had defined some processes and they defined a technology strategy. And what you see on the screen was my view at a high level as to why what the approach they were taking was not going to get them to where they wanted to go. But the big thing is, I thought the approach that they were going to take was going to cost them somewhere between $500 million and $2 billion in value over the next 5 years or so. And as I go through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to explain why it is that I came to that conclusion. But one of the things that I thought was a problem for them is that the processes that they had defined lacked formal and effective capabilities for achieving the things you see on the screen. So for managing cost structures, profits and cash flow, inventory investments, and customer value propositions, especially when it comes to segment performance. I think that one of the biggest challenges that companies have is being able to manage resource allocation between target setting and resource allocation between segments that have shared resources. I find that when you get into situations like this is really where IBP really, any weaknesses in the IBP system, this is really where it shows itself. So that at a high level is like I say, the conclusions that I had shared with this company. And so as we go through now, what I'm going to do is talk about, so how is it that I came to these conclusions, and what were the frameworks, and some of the things that I used to help me reach that conclusion. So let me start here, and what I'd like to do is talk about what I think, one of the big things that I think that IBP does, and whether you call it integrated business planning or integrated financial, integrated whatever, I mean, ultimately what you're trying to do is connect inputs and outputs. And, one of the things I was really trying to do is describe, like, what is it ultimately that, that a process like this ought to do? And to me, like, a really good process ought to allow strategies and cost structures to quickly self-adjust to changing market conditions and priorities to optimize both financial and operational results. I mean, to me, that's ultimately what you're really trying to do. So one of the things I found that that prevents companies from doing these sorts of things is what I've shown on the screen. So one of the things I find, if you look at when you get into larger companies, what they're really lacking are formal optimization mechanisms. And there's really kind of four business issues here. Like they still have what I would call inaccurate models, functional silos, disconnected targets, and slow processes. And what I'm going to talk about are four incremental capabilities that fix these things and what you need to do to fix those problems. And much of this is going to be driven off of shared predictive and prescriptive analytics models and processes. And as well, one of the things I think that you really need to be able to do to drive the value of IBP is have profit and cash flow accountability. And when you get into like business segments that cut across multiple like business segments or business units that cut across multiple functions, legal entities, companies I find are really not doing this very well at all. And I'm going to, as this slide is up, I'll just talk to you about a conversation I had with a guy. He was the head of financial planning and analysis for a large steel manufacturer. And, one of the things he described was, well, we're using what I'm told are kind of leading sales and operations planning or IBP tools or whatever you want to call it. We're using what is regarded as being one of the leading financial tools. So why is it that I still have such problem with forecast accuracy, in particular cash flow? Why is it that my cash flow is so bad? And scenario planning, why is it that I still don't have one system where I can do scenario planning, where I can simultaneously look at financial and operational? And why is it that, I still have to push people to, to be involved with the process? So if you look at what's on the screen here, if you look at various research studies that have been done over the last 10 years or so, these basically summarize a lot of the results of those research studies and really talk about, well, what is it that companies are really experiencing? And one I've kind of highlighted here, this cross-functional alignment and decision rights that eliminate silos. I actually took the liberty of looking at like 30 or 40 different research studies. Anyways, here's the results. It's actually closer to 30 actually. But I look at all these different research studies, and one of the questions I asked, well, what are the major barriers that you face in achieving certain issues or certain objectives? And what you'll find is the number one problem faced by all these different companies is functional silos. So, functional silos is nothing new. I mean, we've been talking about it for eons, but the reality is, if you look at the financial and operational systems that are being used today, we talk a lot about eliminating, data silos, but not so much about functional silos. Because in reality, if you look at, the processes that a lot of companies are using today to drive like resource allocation, which is basically budgets and all that, they're really not that different than what they were like 50 or 100 years ago. They certainly look a lot faster. They got nice new shiny tools, but if you look at the process, they're still very functionally driven, and that's a huge problem, I think, for when it comes to improving the value and improving the execution. I think that's still a challenge for a lot of companies. And it's actually costing companies a lot of money. Now, if you look at this slide, I actually, on my, in the videos I have, I actually have a video that shows the actual research results from where these things actually came. And I'm not going to go into all detail on all of them, but for those of you who are looking at digital transformation, up here, most don't improve performance, profitable growth. Very few companies grow profitably. Cost reductions don't stick. I mean, to me, one of the problems, or what the underlying thing that cuts across all of these different research results, is the fact that we don't plan, manage, and govern outcomes. We still plan and manage in silos. And I think that one of the things that that companies talk about when they experience these things is complexity. And it's really all about how do you manage complexity. And if you look at what complexity costs, to me, 3 to 5% of sales is a number that I read in a study by A.T. Kearney. Actually, he was my former employer of mine. But it's very consistent of what I've experienced in my career. So to me, this 3 to 5% is probably a good gauge on whether you're managing complexity costs and what it's really costing you. And one of the things, if you look at these interconnected challenges and the value erosion I just talked about, one of the few leading indicators that tells me that this is going to be, you're going to find these things, is cash flow forecasting. And when Eric talks, one of the things I believe that we're going to be talking about, we're going to find, is that companies are really struggling with this. In fact, I've actually written a couple of articles. I've spoken on, from a treasury perspective. You look at treasury and some of the challenges experienced by treasurers, cash flow forecasting is kind of the top of the list. So, we've had all these innovations, like we talk about, these forecasting innovations we've had. Why is it that we cannot turn that into an accurate cash flow forecast? So to me, this is, like I said, sort of a leading indicator. So this is the first place where I talk about this maturity model. So just kind of getting back to, the head of FP&A that I was talking to, one of the things I really kind of struggled to do before I had this maturity model was really define in clear terms, why is it that he was having these problems and what gaps was he experiencing? And by the way, in those videos, I actually have an hour-long video that describes this maturity model in gory amounts of detail. So I'm only going to be just kind of covering it at a high level. But what I'm really talking about is the difference between what I'm calling strategic and tactical IBP. And this ability to manage complexity and manage outcomes just really represents the difference between these two things. And the thing is, in order to get this 3 to 5%, you've got to do two things. You've got to plan, but you also have to have performance management that drive profit and strategy alignment. You have to have both. You can't have one without the other. So to me, strategic IBP, as I said before, was planning, managing, and governing outcomes versus kind of balancing supply and demand. And so when I talked to this gentleman at the very outset with the case I mentioned before, this is really where I came up with, why is it that they're not going to achieve the value that they were talking about? So, based on discussions with, various people within the organization, what we came up with was a value was probably between $300 to $500 million annually. I mean, that's what I think strategic IBP was worth to them. If you look at some of the challenges that they certainly had unprofitable products and customers, which they really, one of the problems is that they didn't really have good planning systems that help them understand how products and customers would impact cash and prevent those from getting into the organization. And the path that they were on really were not going to address the underlying problems there. And ultimately, what they were heading towards was a tactical IBP process, the 5-step model, and it just wasn't going to address this. And ultimately, what I see, if you look in the marketplace, that, while you may look at individual applications like a IBP process or an FP&A process or application, and it may be kind of a leader in that market, I don't think that they are doing what I call kind of leading processes. There's just far too many capability gaps that are falling between the cracks. And those gaps are probably one of the primary reasons why you see results like this. So this is one that was done this year by FSN, which is like a financial management publication or website, where they did a research study that said 86% of analytics efforts are missing the mark. And I think it goes to these capability gaps that I was talking about. And it's the capability gaps. If you look at, the various different types of applications that you'll see on the market, like financial planning and budgeting, sales and operations planning, balanced scorecard. When I look at all these different types of applications, what I'm seeing is that, some of them they're probably a lot more efficient, but I think that there's actually been, in my estimation, a real lack of development in these areas. And the thing is that the capability gaps that are impacting S&OP and financial planning are the same ones impacting all these other things. I mean, kind of like if I really kind of think about it from a broader perspective, if you think of how kind of ERP evolved like 20 or 30 years ago, and think about like nobody in their right mind would buy an ERP system or would buy separate, financial systems and, that were different from the builds and materials and routings and the operational system. Nobody would do that. So the question why has that not happened to planning? I mean, when you really think about it, it's never really happened. And I think that ultimately that's one of the problems that we've had. We're still thinking of these tools in silos. And let me just talk to you about, just go back to the case study at the very beginning, because one of the way that their strategy was in terms of how they looked at IBP, like if you look at their cost structure, like about 55% of their cost structure was in supply chain, and then the other 35% in indirect costs, which a lot of people call overhead, and their 10% were really fixed. So their whole approach, they had like an IBP system that focused on this, and their approach was that, well, we were going to combine that with a financial system, and lo and behold, we should be able to have an IBP process. Reality is that does not work. And I say that as someone, like, I think I'm pretty familiar with the entire financial planning space. In fact, I would say that I have a pretty deep understanding of what these tools do. 90% of the applications are on the Gartner quadrant. I know them quite well. There's no way that they're going to support, these sorts of processes that support indirect costs. If you look at the complexity of organizations today, one of the things I think that a lot of organizations are not realizing that, the models that underlie supply chain planning are actually the same ones you need to do cash flow forecasting. And these same models, which are really kind of prescriptive analytics models, are the same ones you need to do indirect costs. So this whole combining of, an IBP tool with a financial tool is flawed right from the very outset. And what I think organizations really need is one tool and one set of processes that drive everything. And I'll talk to you about, that the technology is actually there to do it. I don't think that anybody has really kind of broken through and shown how it works, but the technology is all there. And the thing is, the money is so big that I think that organizations really need to be looking at it. So kind of one of the key things I just want to leave you with in this section is that I think there's these capabilities that I talked about are really kind of falling between the cracks of kind of financial and operational and strategic tools. And I think this is really problematic for companies who are really trying to take that next step in IBP. So, key takeaways here, the gaps remain, they're not being addressed, they're falling between the cracks, and they're undermining strategy and eroding value. That's kind of the key takeaway here. So that is just my take on, like I say, the maturity model and capability gaps. Again, I've got an hour-long presentation on the website that'll explain that in more detail. If you want to have a look at it. Let me just talk about another client situation that I had. I think it really kind of drives home a couple of things. So this company was a publisher of books, and they had significant deterioration in their performance. You can see the high inventories and stock outs, and this kind of followed like a long annual planning and budgeting process. We were brought in by the head of supply chain to kind of fix the problem and give some kind of cursory thoughts on whether they should be investing in a new ERP system, because they really had a lack of agreement on whether they actually really needed one or not. So what ended up happening, well, we ended up recovering control, but the problem still wiped out of like half of their profits. And one of the key conclusions that we gave was that they really had really ineffective planning processes. Their supply chain planning was actually really understaffed, and they were going to have significant problems with their in the future without an ERP system. And actually, one of the key things that I ended up saying at the very beginning was that, and both the CFO and head of supply chain were in the room when we said this. And one of the things I ended up saying is that, your supply chain planning group is probably understaffed, probably at least by half, to which the CFO really kind of pushed back and said, gee, I don't believe that. You're going to have to show me how you got there. So I'm just going to kind of help you run through very quickly how we kind of got there. So let me just talk to you quickly. And this, by the way, I've kind of just simplified the numbers to kind of illustrate, how we came to this conclusion. Let's assume if you look at this is the number of books that they publish, and kind of here's the mix. When you get into A's, we're kind of really basically the simple types of books, and these ones are the more complex ones. And what comprised more complex books is that what this company did was they sold textbooks to universities and high schools and whatever. And what was happening over the years was that, a book was not a book anymore. So, if it was a history book, you didn't have one, you had, California wanted to have, their some history of theirs, and New York likewise. And so books, you got multiple books now. And oh, by the way, we're now offering teacher's aid. Some of the stuff is, online, digital, and, so, you're not just selling one book. There's a whole bunch of things that come with a book. So if you look at, how they were managing these books in the past, you'd say, well, these books, we do 5 reviews a year. This one, we really, because they're so complex, we need to do 50 reviews a year. Here's the time per review. Here's total hours. Here's the total FTEs. And this number here was really the basis upon which they'd been doing, resource allocation, planning, and budgeting over the past X number of years. But what was really happening, and by the way, this was these were the numbers that actually drove budgeting process. But what was actually really happening was that, the mix was changing. So really the number of, if you just take their service levels, what they really needed were about, in this case, 46 people actually to do this work. In fact, what was happening was that they were reducing the service levels here, which is in fact why they ended up having the problems that they were having, because they just didn't really have enough people. And the real kicker here is that, they had a whole digital transformation strategy, and that if you look at how that was going to change, you just do the math, the numbers were staggering. And, when I explained this to them, the thing that I got back was, holy shit, I didn't realize that was a problem. To which, the person who was actually heading up the supply chain group said, look, I've been telling you this for the last 5 years. When we go to do when we go to do budgeting, I've been asking for more people. You, Mr. CFO, have just chosen not to listen to me. And because, you've been looking at the entire, you've been looking at history and saying you've got enough people, and that's just not the case. So there was a big revelation here that, wow, I didn't actually realize this was happening. And this really, if you look at, this was really a symptom of, segment differences and mix changes. And, when I also presented this case to the company I started off with. And when I said this, a whole bunch of people in the room said, shit, that's happening at our company. I can give you 100 examples of where that's happening. And these things, and the thing is that this is really symptomatic of kind of like financial driver-based planning systems, not really deriving what's really happening in the business, failure to connect business objectives to operational plans, and how strategy affects operations. So even though this is a fairly simplistic example, imagine that you're actually running like a shared service center where you have a supply chain group serving multiple business units. This gets even more complicated, and this actually these types of things happening. So just kind of give you an idea of how integrated planning could evolve. I did all this on spreadsheets and gave the head of the supply chain these spreadsheets. But what ended up happening was that she used to spend 6 to 8 weeks on annual budgets. Armed with this model, if you will, we ended up cutting that down to about 2 days. And so there was no more game playing. The whole conversation was, tell me what's coming at me, what the volume is, tell me what service levels you want, and I'll tell me how many people you need. And it all also changed, I think, the whole culture of that function. Because if you look at how she was involved with the budgeting process, if you look at, I call these unwritten rules, a number of you will probably look at these things, and these things may look familiar. So always under promise, no over deliver, never submit your real budget the first time. All these are caused because, one of the primary things is that target setting and resource allocation isn't fair. It's really kind of the underlying belief there. So kind of the key takeaway here, why this is so relevant to IBP. If we're trying to drive strategy with IBP, you better be covering the white space. And what we're talking about here is kind of white space work, because these things are central to executing strategy. And the next one is that target setting and resource allocation must be part of the process to reduce cycle time and to drive the right behavior. So you can't have an S&OP process over here and a separate budgeting process and target setting process. You're going to have very little luck in changing behaviors. If you've got these sorts of things happening, you're not going to change them unless you have one process that drives them all together. And that's why I believe that if you're not looking at rolling forecasts and S&OP as part of the same process, you're probably looking in the wrong direction, because I think it all needs to kind of hang together. So that's kind of a key takeaway from all that and why it's so important. So that is kind of give you an understanding of why, kind of looking at some of the broader aspects of planning. Next one thing I want to talk about is just the capabilities themselves. So I talked about these capabilities, or introduced these capabilities before. I just want to give you an idea of what they look like, and what they should, and how you use them in a system. So the first one I talked about was, we talk about productivity and trade-off management, outcome management. I'll talk about that next. So to me, if you think of take one slide away from this entire thing, like one picture that was kind of like the wow, like how should integrated business planning really change if you really believe it's supposed to drive strategy, this is what it ought to look like. To me, if you look on this picture on the right-hand side, you should be able to get that picture. You should have a forward-looking view of what that picture looks like. It's because, one of the things you want to be able to do is drive horizontal planning. So as a segment leader, you want to be able to drive, with your customer value proposition into your processes. And one of the foundations for doing that, you have to reconcile your functional view of the organization to your process view of the organization. Because, if you think, if IBP is going to be a decision-making process, one thing I found is that if you're really going to try to get people to drive decisions and take accountability for cross-functional outcomes, if it doesn't reconcile to the general ledger, you haven't got a hope in hell of accomplishing that. Never going to happen. So you really have to have something that's kind of reconciling these two views. So in the case of an order to cash process, you think of the overall cash per order. How does that filter down to kind of what's happening in the warehouse, for example? And oh, by the way, how does that differ between different segments and different locations? That's the sort of thing you ought to be looking at. And when you look at segment objectives, you want to take these different views and say, well, how does different segments, what should we be gearing towards? And like, if I'm trying to align my customer value proposition with my cost structure, how does that translate down into, say, a cost per order? I mean, that is how you engineer a cost structure. And I believe that if you look at an IBP process, one of the key things it ought to do is help you engineer your cost structures. So, and what that does is allow you to have more effective commercial operations, because one of the things you want to have is commercial people that are tasked with managing these trade-offs. So you want them, and the other thing as well is that one of the implicit assumptions in, if you look at traditional IBP is that you can manage inventory levels independent of cost to serve. And to me, that's just not the case. If you're like inventory levels are just an element of service, and that you've got other parts of your cost structure that you need to be managing. And this was a problem with the company that we started off at the very beginning. They were it was a margin-based process. They had no view of how they were going to do this with their commercial people. And that was kind of like one of their underlying problems. And this was actually included in the article, but basically what I'm just kind of summarizing this in a slightly different way is that what you really want to do is connect this trade-off, a customer segment down to a process. And you need to have something that fills all that in. Now, I'm not going to get into gory detail on all this, but if you're not specifically managing outcomes and having them defined, you're not going to get too far. Now, all this would just be overkill for like a $25 million manufacturer. There's no way you need to get into this amount of detail. But when you get into complex companies, this is where you need to have it, because the cost structures are just far too complicated. And this is really what you need to have: effective mechanisms for delegating accountability for profits and cash flow. So those are kind of first two things. The next one I really want to talk about: integrated scenarios. Now, if you ask different people, like, what's an integrated scenario? Again, you'll get 10 different answers. But to me, an integrated scenario is something that will allow you to simultaneously answer all of these questions. There's a lot of things going on here, and I'm not gonna go through all of them, but these are the sorts of things that companies are really struggling with. And you want to be able to do this while also coping with a whole bunch of changes. That, to me, the absence of the ability to do this is why companies are still struggling with COVID and scenario planning. And especially when I see kind of like financial software companies talking about scenario planning and coping with change, they don't even come remotely close to doing anything along these lines. I think that, there's a bit of a stretch. So one of the things I find here is that if you're really going to have an integrated solution that process that supports finance and ops, it needs to be able to do this. But a classic example of this, to me, if somebody asked me, like, what would be a really good example of an integrated solution? To me, it's like, if you've got a global company, and if your system's actually really integrated, you should be able to look at, if you've got a brand new product that's going to be kind of a major push, you should be able to look at that product and say, how's my cash flow, inventory positions, and profits and margin cost structures, and foreign currency exposure, how is all that stuff going to be affected by this product launch? You should be able to have that at your fingertips. And I don't think any companies are even remotely close to having something like that. And that's a major problem, because if you look at why cost structures don't behave so well, as a guy I've done piles of activity-based costing and cost structure work, this is where costs get out of whack, because you don't understand how to reverse engineer your cost structure. And as well, one of the things that's kind of going missing, I think, on both financial and operational supply chain, is that prescriptive analytics, or if you want to call it supply chain optimization, finance is going to want to utilize this a lot. I see finance being a huge user of prescriptive analytics. And right now, if you look at prescriptive analytics, I can't even tell you one financial software company that's even remotely close to having something like this. I mean, the reality, what's really happening here is that, the things that finance is going to need to become, analytically relevant are sitting in supply chain. Yet, supply chain software companies aren't always looking at finance as their customer, I think. And I think that's a bit of a mess. So to me, that's one of the gaps that's kind of falling between the cracks. And, there's a few key issues I see kind of falling between the cracks here. For example, in this one company, they were talking about building a process where revenue, demand planning and pricing were all separate processes. To me, they ought to be one process. You want to have, you want to be able to have extend planning to the rest of supply chain, or to the rest of the organization beyond supply chain, and you want to have end-to-end scenario planning. I just don't see where that's actually happening in most major companies, and I see that as being a huge gap, as well as cash flow forecasting and some of these other ones. I just think there's too many flags on the field that saying, you know, there's some capability gaps here. And what I see happening is that we're designing solutions in silos. You know, finance has got one, ops has got another, and never the twain shall mate. So I think this is a real problem. So that to me are kind of the key capabilities. Again, like I've got a separate video that describes these 4 capabilities in more detail. You can refer to those, but those are the main ones to be aware of. So let me just talk to you about kind of technology enablers. So I don't want to just kind of say, well, what's wrong and not tell you how to fix them. So first off, I just want to say about 10 years ago, I used to work for a prescriptive analytics company or supply chain optimization company or whatever you want to call it. And, you know, one of the things, we were doing some pretty advanced things there. And we actually had 2 cases, and by the way, I'm not promoting them because they've since gone out of business. But, you know, one of the things I saw, like we had a couple of case studies where we saved companies like more than $1 billion, massive sums of money. And the reason why that money existed is because if you look at the way companies still plan and manage their business, it's still fragmented and siloed. You know, the reality is that, you know, the financial systems will always be the thing that that's really driving everything. And if your financial planning processes are siloed, you cannot help but suboptimize resource allocation. You know, you can mitigate some of that with some operational tools, but you know, I think that most companies are really kind of struggling to integrate those things. So there's massive opportunities, and one of the reasons why, you know, the company I was working for went out of business, and why I've seen other ones go out of business, is that we had these really, really amazing planning models. It was just so sophisticated. The problem was we didn't have a process to maintain it. It was just a massive undertaking to update these models. And I see that as being a major problem, especially when you want to try and reconcile it to finance. It's a real problem. So just going back to this definition of strategic IBP, which is planning, managing, government outcomes, I just want to talk about like what are the enablers? And there's really the prescriptive and predictive analytics you've heard of before, but the problem is I don't think that they've actually been effectively embedded into planning processes. And the things that embed them in the planning processes are what I would call planning platforms. Now, I would refer to these as kind of supply chain solutions that are supporting both financial and operational planning. I'm not going to touch on that one much. I know that Stefan is going to talk a little bit about, you know, what sort of capabilities really constitute that type of application. I'm going to focus more on what's called low-code application development platforms as being to me, this is like a game breaker. And, you know, I'm actually doing some work right now with a company that's really looking at, you know, how low-code applies to planning and how it can bring together financial and operational planning. So I'm not going to go through all this stuff, but if you look up on the internet as to what's happening in low code, there's not a single place that's telling you this is not a game breaker. And the reason I'm telling you this is that because the low code offers huge reductions in time to value and cost of developing process. Plus, it offers a number of different capabilities. And I'm not going to talk about them all. There's the main thing that you should take away from this is that this is going to be a key driver of integrated financial and operational planning. You know, when you look at like the ERP example I gave you earlier, to me, if you're looking to integrate your systems, you had better be having these sorts of capabilities at their core. If you're not, you're going to be struggling to bring these systems together. And I think that, you know, especially when you look at older supply chain tools, they're not even remotely close to having things like this. Similar to to my company I worked with at Genova, it wasn't even close to this. It's something I think that most companies will actually need to have. And I think it's going to have massive implications in terms of cost to implement, time to value, and as well, I think it'll actually drive significant opportunities for self-funding IBP applications. So anyway, that was sort of like kind of like the what's new part of the session about how to drive strategic IBP. The last section I want to leave off with is kind of like the financial impact, because I think it's a really important one. Because I think that's really what's happening, and this goes back to this conclusion comes back to the company I was initially talking about, that one of the biggest problems that companies are designing IBP to kind of like the 4-stage process without kind of integrating finance. And in this particular case, finance was sort of an afterthought. Nobody even thought about, well, gee, we ought to be re-engineering the budgeting process. And oh, by the way, how do we bring together rolling forecasts and SNOP? Not even on the radar screen. To me, you need to understand what this end state process is, and that's not what they did. The reality is that this is why most companies are hitting a wall. I think as well, like, to me, if you're a global company, if you're not focused on financial process, and I'll say specifically a cash flow, because cash flow is the last thing that's going to kind of fall into place. If you're not focused on cash flow over here, you're probably not going to get there. And in this company's case, what they did was that, the tools that they were looking at were not even going to come close to this. So you need to look beyond this to the end state. And, I think some will argue, well, gee, our application does, well, our solution will generate a cash flow, but, I think that there's some questions you need to ask. First of all, is the thing actually even accurate or not? And oh, by the way, will you be able to do it by segment? And can you quantify how volume and mix is going to affect cash flows, throughout the entire organization? I mean, it should actually be automating variances and operational reconciliation. You should be able to get through the cycle within a month. I mean, if somebody's telling you I can do this, but by the way, we're not going to get it done till the 6th week. That's not acceptable. If you're doing scenario planning, if you've got spreadsheets involved anywhere in scenario planning process, that's not a good thing either. Because I'll tell you that in most, if you look at kind of like the supply chain solutions used, the flow-based models which underlie the kind of supply chain planning, those are what I call more dynamic models. I explain that in a fair amount of detail in some of my other videos, but these are the sorts of things that you ought to be looking at. And that, I can tell you, is not happening. And one of the things I'm going to be putting up in the next week or so is a description of, like if you were going to describe to somebody who knew nothing about integrated planning, what should the process look like? What should he see? These are some of the things that they should see. So for example, you should never have to do manual financial and operational planning reconciliation, which I believe kind of is really what happens in 99% of the companies. And you can see the rest of them, you'll be able to look at it all, but this is really what you ought to look for. But the other thing is, like, to me, if you're developing an IBP process that supports strategy, when you have a process that really does it, your CFO should be jumping up and down and be thrilled by what you're doing. And in this other company's case, I'll tell you, the finance really didn't understand how it was working. So for example, if you look at all the activities that ought to go away, plan reconciliation. The other one is planning model management. Like for one of the things that financial systems do is they try to develop models that estimate how operational models. That should actually go away. If you've really got an integrated system, that should actually go away as well, all of these things. So, this should be an enormous productivity improvement for finance. And in the company's case from the very beginning, that wasn't happening. In fact, that they were going to have to add people. So the reality is that if you're not thinking along these lines, your finance guy is not going to be terribly excited. And, really they should be, because I think that what's happening now is that finance people, I've actually talking to people where finance is actually taking over and looking at finance as being a driver of the next version of integrated planning. So I've actually got a video, and I've got a little blog on this thing that's specific to finance. So anybody on here that's, from a finance perspective is struggling to improve it, I've got a little thing on that. So that leads us to kind of the kind of a summary here. These are the initial questions I started off with. Hopefully I've answered these for you. But as well, just some key takeaways for you. Like, to me, one of the things I think that's really missing is educating the executive team, not about, the traditional 4-step process, but what IBP means from an integrated perspective. Like, what should the executive team be looking for? And you really got to make a deliberate choice to implement strategic IBP. Plus, you've got to define your end-to-end processes up front, meaning I know precisely how cash flow forecasting is going to behave and how we're going to phase this in over time. You may do tactical IBP, traditional supply and demand balancing as a first step, but you know exactly how that's going to happen and how you're going to phase it in over time and how that's going to deliver cash flow. And to me, to get there, you got to have the right leader who understands this stuff. So, leave you with this picture here. This is kind of like something I picked up, is kind of like the March of the Lemmings, and I'll let Richard kind of pick up on this because I know that he was actually the one that kind of shared this with me. So Richard, I'll let you kind of provide some commentary here.
Thanks, Dean. It's a lot. There's a couple of things in here that really rang true to me, right? And it's some of the comments you were making about, look, this has got to be one single process and workflow together, right? So in practice, where we're failing right now is, I'll give you an example. I'm not connecting the financial and the operational planning, right? I've got a tool where I'm trying to do IBP completely disconnected from the financial tools. One of the issues I have there is financial tools they're chart of account tools, right? In my IBP process, I'm trying to make decisions around activities. My chart of accounts isn't aligned to my activities. So that's kind of preventing from doing, we're defining market segments, market sub-segments, and I want to approach each of these sub-segments differently in my IBP process. But I really can't all I can do is volume balancing. My financial system's disconnected, so I'm taking an average price, I'm taking an average cost from my finance system, pulling them in, and without being able to financially value the trade-offs that I may want to go to one segment with a shorter lead time. Shorter lead time means that I've got a stock in local warehousing versus longer lead times where I'm going to ship internationally, things like that. I can't really balance between those two, or run different scenarios between those two segments that show me, well, how does this impact my cash flow forecast, right? It all comes, if I bring up in our project, well, we need to address our budgeting process, we need to address our financial system too. That's kind of hands off. No, you have a planning tool. It's not the forecast. The financial systems are not within scope of your IBP project and the tools you're looking at. Does that make sense?
Interesting situation.
Yeah, it's defining. You say define the process, the end-to-end process up front. Yeah, well, I want to define my end-to-end processes. Look, I'm generating a cash flow forecast for the next 24 to 36 months that I can achieve, that's achievable, but it's also got the components in that forecast that says, here's my risks, here's my headwinds, my tailwinds. Here are the levers around how I'm going to generate revenue, how I'm going to control cost that I need to be managing, right? With the financial system separate than the planning system. The planning system is, well, here's the volume we're going to target to sell. Here's the volume we're going to target to supply. Well, okay, but I've got a set amount of volume, and I've got multiple segments that I want to choose from on where that volume should go. Right? I want to be able to say no to certain segments, and I really want to drive going into other segments because I can get a better return in certain segments. If I don't connect my financial system to the IBP planning process at that level that I'm making those decisions, I really can't make those decisions, right?
Yeah.
So I don't get to where I'm really doing free cash flow. I'm not able to differentiate how I approach my planning, how I forecast, and how I supply based on segments. I can't do it integrated. I've got in my IBP cycle is a monthly cycle. I got to run a few scenarios. My cash flow isn't integrated. My cash flow is sequential process now. I do the volume planning in these tools. I pass it over to my financial system. They come back in my next cycle with, okay, well, here's your monthly P&L. Here's your free cash flow projection. Doesn't meet where we want to be. All right, now I have to go through the next cycle. All right, let's try again. Let's come up with some different routines and see if we can come up with anything. Right? I don't want this to be sequential. I want the language of my demand meeting to be revenue. I want the language of my supply meeting to be spend. I want to get into an integrated reconciliation or a management S&OP meeting. And I want to be able to balance those two as far as, well, here's the cash flow I'm going to generate over the next 24 months that I'm going to use to fund and grow my business, right? And I want to be able within my monthly cycle to say, well, okay, here's decisions we have to make now in order to optimize, drive more revenue, reduce more costs while maintaining the strategy I've set for each of these segments.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
so a lot of what you're saying really rings true here to me.
Oh, well, that's good to hear from a practitioner. I'm just curious as to whether there are some comments from others in that are other attendees, or whether there are questions or comments that they want to make. I think Richard might have started off the process and kind of getting people engaged in this discussion. So I'm just curious where what other people are feeling, or like I said, whether there are any questions about what we talked about.
You did have some questions in the chat box, Dean, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And for the rest of the participants, it's now open for Q&A for the next roughly 10 minutes.
Hey, Dean, there was a question from Duncan early on.
Mm-hmm.
11:40 a.m.
Yeah, I think you actually covered that. Thanks. That was
Okay, all right.
most of Dean's talk. Thanks. Okay.
Good.
Dean,
Hello.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Hi, it's Karina. Hi, I would like to congratulate Dean for the excellent presentation and for sharing the very valuable information. I found it very enlightening. I have a question regarding IBP. From the experience that I have, which is basically operational roles and then consultancy roles that are more related to implementation of planning systems, and from previously working with a company that actually had recently implemented IBP. And I thought that was a good, the way that they have done it, I thought it was quite interesting, because what it happened is that the financial planning and supply planning was happening in, in a system, in a silo system, yes, but it was for the tactical perspective. And the focus was on the next year, or basically 6 months, next year, 1 year. But because of financial planning was consuming this input from forecasting quantities, so the demand planner was needed to complete that for the next 3 years for financial purposes, because finance was using the volumes from these planning tools. So I thought that was a good start of connection, of the tactical decisions, tactical commercial decisions for the short term or mid-term period to, to feed finance. And that information was used by finance to do the financial planning. It's more like medium to large, long term. So that was very useful, because then based on that, they can set, aspirational targets, check scenarios in their system, in their financial system. And then also, once there is a, then there was a feedback loop to the tactical, team, to supply planning, demand planning. So that I found very interesting, because I recognize that, it will be good to have a one system, but we don't have one system that comprise, one model for financial planning and, all that tactical planning operations, right? So what will be a good compromise? I'm thinking, because considering that it's quite complex, I believe, at the moment to have that system, or it doesn't exist as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, well, that's actually why I introduced the idea. I talked about low-code application development platforms. So there's kind of a few ways to use them. Like if you've got a greenfield opportunity, like if you don't have any systems, they certainly provide an interesting opportunity. But for companies that have existing systems, I could actually see low-code being used as a means to fill a bunch of gaps, because without going into gory details about low code, one of the things I've probably spent, because, the project I was working on, I was asked, one thing I was asked was, how do you do this? Like exactly the question you just asked. So what options are available out there? And after I probably looked at probably 20 different low-code application development platforms, and some are really not that sophisticated. They're overly simplified, but some that I've come across are incredibly good. And I think if you've got holes in your applications, it will really be dependent upon the situation, but low-code could actually really fill a lot of gaps, I think. And obviously it'll depend on, how flexible your scenario planning systems are and that kind of thing. But I would say that that's certainly a starting point, because I think, I first came across low code probably like a year and a half ago. And as I started doing more, I started looking at it more, the more the light switches started going on, because, I just saw, wow, for companies who just currently who've invested a lot of money in kind of supply chain tools and financial tools, here's something that could actually glue them together in a really solid process. And I think that would work in certain situations. Some situations, it would be different, but it'll be different in every situation. And like I say, if companies are looking at, if they're looking at replacing or investing in, IBP or financial solutions, I think low-code based applications to me are just a phenomenal opportunity, because I think that, personally, I think that low-code will, in the next 2 to 5 years in the IBP space, should become much more commonplace. I think if you look at the things that are missing, I think a big part of it is that. So, as you saw before, the company I used to work for, we've had planning models, some sophisticated planning models for years. That's nothing new. But how to glue it together into a process, that's new. And I think that low code is going to be a huge game changer. So hopefully I answered your question.
Dean, I have
Yes,
one,
Dean, thank you so much.
Sure.
I
Sorry.
have one
Thank you.
sorry, question for you on, so educate the executive team and get the right leader. Your slide that you talked about tactical versus strategic IBP. For educating my executive team, when most places we've been, we bring in a Big Four consultant, somebody like that. Their education is probably what I would consider to be on the tactical IBP, right? How do I do that? How do I get my executive team exposed to strategic IBP as opposed to the tactical?
Yeah, that's an interesting, I mean, it becomes, it's harder to do like when you're first starting out, if this is like an initial implementation of IBP, and if people are, if their mindset is that, you know, the traditional four-step process is in fact best practice, that's a tough one. But, you know, I think to the extent that you can get the executive team to buy into, you know, I mean, ultimately the objective is to optimize free cash flow or cash flow. If they're buying into that one, you know, if they say that's the objective, you know, I think probably the easiest way to say it is kind of like what I talked about at the outset, that, you know, the objectives that you set out to achieve are not going to be supported by the systems that you've specified. You know, I think that's probably you got to anchor it with an objective. I mean, so that's the easiest one to anchor, I think.
And Richard, I'll pick up on that.
Dean?
Yeah.
May I add something or to your comment?
Oh, absolutely.
Richard, if the platform is well designed, it should be able to, the same modeling and planning app should be able to support both type of scenarios. The difference is in the granularity, the planning horizon, and possibly the way you will derive the coefficients that you want to analyze or run. But if I'm thinking of in the area of supply chain strategy, for example, the same model and tool can run a strategic scenario and a tactical S&OP scenario. It's different levels of detail. It shouldn't be that complicated if the right application and tools are in place.
Okay.
By the way, one question came up. I'm just reading in the chat here. I don't know if Len, you were going to mention it, but it's from Raul. It's actually a really good question. It says, I don't know if everybody can see the chat. What's your view on the data in the context of strategic IBP? Currently, many evolved and big companies do not have data in the right shape to drive basic S&OP, IBP. So what data needs, what data needs we need to address the starting point? I mean, that's an excellent question, because it's so true. Because if you don't have good data, you can't kind of really move forward. I think kind of two things I would say to that. Number one, if you've got multiple systems, it makes it increasingly difficult to have good data. You know, you're going to have different master data across different systems, which is again where I think low code comes in. But the other thing is that, you know, a lot of companies are looking at master data management. In fact, really good low code systems should in fact embed master data management systems into it. And they're, I say that, I'm trying to think of what I can say in the next couple of minutes without making a big presentation on this, because this could actually deserve a presentation in and of itself. But I would say that low code is probably one of the best ways to kind of get your master data in shape, together with an integrated, holistic and integrated design. So, because one of the things that we recognize too is that, you know, this broader system that we've been talking about, nobody is going to implement this stuff overnight. I mean, you know, it gets implemented in stages. So you got to have something that can phase in both, you know, the models and processes that you want to use together with the data that you need. So I'll kind of leave it there. If you want to contact me offline, I'll be happy to get into this, because like I said, it's a really good question, and we could spend an hour talking about just this one.
Well, it's time for our first break. We will be breaking for 15 minutes and leaving the Zoom session and asking you to link back in at 12:15 in the East, 10:15 here in Mountain Time, 5:15 in the UK. Let me just mention, all our sessions are being recorded, and shortly after the end of the conference, you'll be able to view them on YouTube. In addition, if you have other questions, our final session in this conference is a panel with all the speakers. And so at the end of the day, questions that have not yet been answered, it's a Q&A with the panel. So at this point, I'm going to ask everyone to leave, and we'll tune back in 15 minutes. Thank you.